Well, this morning, as we give our attention to the study of God's Word, I would invite you to take your Bibles together with me and turn to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. We have a two-part series we're going to do from Daniel chapter 2, starting this week and, Lord willing, concluding next week, as we look at the king's first dream. I say first because he's going to have another one in chapter 4, but in the meantime, we're looking at the king's dream. If you're looking for a title for this morning's message, it's The Dream Dilemma. That's what I'm going with. The D-I-L-E-M-M-A, The Dream Dilemma. And we're going to break this chapter into two pieces. In verses 1 through 23, we have the dream concealed and the dream revealed. And then next week we'll come back and pick up in verse 24 and go to the end of the chapter, and you'll see the dream delivered. Specifically, what will be delivered is what the dream is and what the interpretation of it is, and the concluding demonstration of divine sovereignty. Now, one of the things we've talked about from the very beginning of our study of the book of Daniel is that the whole point of this book is to present the sovereignty of God over all of His creation and over all the nations. From a very biblically historical perspective, one of the things that is necessary to see that is contrary to the view of all the world's nations and pagan religions of that day is that one of the beliefs was if I am a king and I roll into your backyard and I beat you up and I take your stuff and I make you a client kingdom under me, or I take you out and appoint somebody else to govern that location for me, one of the things that I typically do is I walk into the temple or the house you built for your God, and I take all the cool stuff and I bring it home and I put it in my God's temple. Because obviously my God is bigger than your God if I just beat you up, right? That's pretty consistent ancient Near Eastern historical practices. That's a testimony to the power and the greatness of your God if I can come in and I can't beat you. Your God's bigger than my God. You'll see a number of times through the historical books in the Old Testament of how circumstances like this played out and the way that God demonstrated Himself as all-powerful over all other gods. Not only does the nation of Israel go into Canaan and wipe out all those gods, not only does God, through Moses, do a number of signs and wonders and then deliver Israel from bondage in Egypt and bring them into the Promised Land, but even from that point forward, for example, in the days of Samuel, you'll remember there was a time when the ark is stolen by the Philistines and they put it in the household of their God. And lo and behold, their statue of their God gets knocked over multiple times. And then everybody in the town gets sick. And then finally they say, we're doomed. Why did we take this ark? It's killing us. And they look for a way by which they can send it back because they're acknowledging that the God of Israel is the one true God. Okay? There's a whole bunch of other circumstances like this that you can study throughout the Old Testament and see time and time again that God demonstrates Himself to be the one true God. In fact, the overarching message of the prophets to the nation of Israel is this: all the other gods are the creation of men's imaginations and their hands. I don't care if you're talking about a wooden totem pole with faces carved in it, or a stone statue, or a golden idol. They are the product of men's hands, and I made you. That makes all of them inanimate, nothing, and I am the sovereign God. And yet, the rebuke to Israel repeatedly is, and yet you chase after idols. You chase after these false gods. Now, idolatry is a bigger subject than that, and it's really outside the scope of what I want to deal with this morning. But when you're talking about the gods that people have of their own imaginations, and there are gods that people have named today, some of them are borrowing from portions of Scripture, etc. But at the end of the day, okay, in an Old Testament context, the view of the world related to Israel going into captivity is it's because the God of Israel is not all that he's always been cracked up to be, right? Well, that's why Daniel 1 is so clear. That's why Daniel 1 is so emphatic from the beginning. If you look again at chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it's the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So this sets the historical context. This is the last of the kings of Judah before Daniel goes into captivity in 605 BC, and before the final wave of Jews going into captivity, before the whole nation goes completely out of existence by 586 BC. It's the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And you know something? He conquered it, and he turned Jehoiakim into a client king. Why? It's not because God couldn't preserve his people. It's because the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar. That's an old archaic reference to Babylon, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now, again, historically, that suggests that my God's bigger than your God, and one of the normal things as a pagan king that I will do is take some of the loot from, not just from your treasury, but from the house of your God. And I'm not going to put it in my treasury. I'm going to designate it to my God. Now, there will be an offense that happens by one of Nebuchadnezzar's descendants when he sits on the throne, and God will address that issue in Daniel chapter 5. But for right now, it looks like the God of Israel cannot preserve his people, but in reality what the Bible is telling us is he's not only able to preserve his people are going into captivity specifically by his design, because in obedience to his, or in faithfulness rather, to his, I just lost my train of thought. I don't know why. 7 alarms going off. Anyways, let me back up a minute. So they go into captivity not because God can't preserve his people, but rather they go into captivity specifically as a consequence of their rebellion against him. And that's the point I was trying to make. Okay? And now when we come into Daniel chapter 2, one of the things you saw in Daniel chapter 1 is that Daniel is unique out of all of those from Judah, all of the Jews that go into captivity. Daniel and his 3 friends are unique because they are absolutely committed to God. And they are committed to living a life devoted to God, even in a foreign land, even when they're in captivity. And God preserves them and raises them up and demonstrates through his gifting of them with their wisdom and their abilities to prove to be above all other candidates and even above all the wise men, the professional wise men that Nebuchadnezzar has on his staff. Now that brings us into Daniel chapter 2. And what you're going to see here again is that God in his sovereignty orchestrates the circumstances there in Babylon to raise Daniel and his 3 friends up into positions of highest authority there in Babylon. And this again, they are part of the first wave of Jews that go into captivity. Why would God single out Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah? Why would he single them out? Because they're really devoted to him. And the reason 4 young men really devoted to God wind up going into captivity is because God personally wants them there to elevate them to a position of authority. So when the rest of his people get there, at the highest level of authority, God has those who are his own looking out for his people and influencing even that pagan nation. It becomes a testimony now as the time of the Gentiles begins. It becomes a testimony to God that his people attest to him and are preserved and protected, even from a fiery furnace, even from the lion's den, even though they're in a foreign land. And all of this demonstrates that God is still sovereign and the God of gods, the God of heaven above, the creator of all things, the one who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-wise. And so what you're going to see in Daniel chapter 2 is that he orchestrates the elevation of Daniel and his three friends not just into positions of authority in the administration of Nebuchadnezzar, but ultimately to the highest offices under Nebuchadnezzar. And I want you to see the way that God does it. Now, again today, because of the nature of the text, I'm going to do a little bit more of an instructive exposition as opposed to a more sermonic one. But there really are, really are two ways that the introduction to this event unfolds for us this morning. So when we take a look at the king's dream, that it begins with a dilemma, and this dilemma unfolds in two stages. Are you ready? So stage 1, God gives the king a dream. Stage 2, God reveals the dream to Daniel. And we're going to look at each of those in turn. This is just a couple of points to hang your thoughts on as we get set up for next week and the unfolding of this drama according to the divine intention. So we start with God giving the king a dream. Verse 1. Notice in the text it says, now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, plural, and his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. Now, I just want to back up and fill in a little historical context. I know we talked about this a few weeks ago, but this is a significant interpretive issue. It's the primary interpretive issue when you get into the book. And that is the dating of it. And what is argued by liberals who want to say this is written long after the fact, which explains how the book of Daniel can contain predictions like the ones we're going to see next week. It contains predictions about the coming kingdoms, coming Gentile kingdoms of the world, and how they're going to happen in order and the way things are going to play out. The only way you can predict any of that stuff is you're writing it after it happens. Okay? So the argument is this is not actually written by Daniel before it happens because it's just, it's too accurate. It couldn't possibly be true. And so there's an effort to look at ways to discredit the truthfulness of the Bible. One of the ways that liberal scholars have sought to do this is by, we talked about the reference in Jeremiah and the reference in Daniel here to the number of years the king had been, that Jehoiakim had been king. There's the same kind of an issue here in Daniel chapter 2. Notice it says it's the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. But if you go back to chapter 1, you'll notice that in verse 5, when the king takes Daniel and his three friends into captivity, it is so that they can receive a daily ration from the king's choice food, and that they would be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they would be able to enter into the king's personal service. And chapter 1 also at the end says that the king evaluated them and found them to be superior to all of the other, not just students that were being examined at that point, but even all of his wise men. Now, if that's 3 years, how can we now in chapter 2 be in the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar? And the answer is very much like what we talked about last time. And that is simply this. If you do your homework in history, what you'll find is that the Battle of Carchemish, we talked about a few weeks ago, is the great battle that happens in the spring of 605 B.C., and Nebuchadnezzar defeats the Assyrian-Egyptian coalition and basically wins the region. And then that same context, within the next month, he rolls into Jerusalem. Now, he is functioning essentially as a co-regent. That means as king together with his dad, but his dad is still alive. Nebuchadnezzar is the one out with the military, out leading the forces and conquering the lands and doing the battles. His dad, Nabopolassar, yes, these names will be on the quiz. his dad, King Nabo, is old, and he's back at home in Babylon. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, he's out on the field of battle and winning the day. And he rolls into Jerusalem. This is the end of the spring of 605 BC, and he tells Jehoiakim, I'm large and in charge. You have two choices. Either I wipe you out, or you pay me taxes, tribute from this point forward. Well, Jehoiakim begins to pay tribute, at least until the Egyptians rise up and think they're a threat that can take on Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Okay, that's going to result in Babylon coming back and thrashing them again, and then you have Jehoiakim taken out of the throne, etc., and the downward spiral till everybody goes into captivity. Well, that spring of 605 is when the Babylonians beat the Egyptian and the Assyrians, roll into Jerusalem, subject Jehoiakim to subordination, and then they take Daniel and his friends into captivity. Okay? That's roughly, should be June of 605 when Daniel and his friends wind up in Babylon beginning their studies. Now, it is a 3-year program. Well, Nebuchadnezzar isn't technically the king at this point. His dad still is. His dad dies in August. And it's not until September that he is crowned officially as king after the proper time of mourning for his dad's departure. Okay? But they don't start counting, because of the years of ascension, they don't start counting his years as king officially until the new year, which is in the spring. So his first year doesn't actually start until Daniel's second year of schooling. And likewise, his second year is at the end of Daniel's schooling. And when they say that Daniel and his 3 friends went through 3 years of school, it's just like what we have here. When you do a 3-year degree, which some of you seminary students are doing it, Mike, in 4 years, and Donald in 40 or 45, something like that. So I'm just teasing. But it's a 3-year program, at least it's intended to be. I did it in actually 2.5 years because... just because you have summers off. So, and I actually took classes even during the summers and started my THM before the 3rd year was up. Okay? So I did a 3-year degree basically in the 6 semesters, and it was less than 3 full calendar years. So all we have here is essentially 3 years as a round number for the education. And so when you look at the text in Daniel 1, Daniel has been evaluated by Nebuchadnezzar and brought in at an entry level as a wise man as part of the official administration of Nebuchadnezzar's government there in Babylon. That happens, and sometime over the next month or 2 is when this event happens, and now it fits just fine into the 2nd year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. All of that is probably more than most of you ever wanted to know. But if you ever study Daniel, this becomes one of the chief arguments to say, see, you can't rely on Daniel being true. There are ways to harmonize all of these kinds of details. In fact, when you start to do some real study into archaeology and history, what you find is it not only makes sense, everything lines up perfectly, demonstrating the historic veracity or the historic reliability and truthfulness of the Scripture. For anybody that spends a lot of time studying it, these kinds of issues and working through them actually wind up being something that brings a lot of confidence in Scripture. Now when we take a look at the text, it's the 2nd year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, historically factually accurate account. And Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. I want you to notice that it's plural. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, plural. And his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Now that idea of the word troubled literally means to be pushed, to be disturbed or agitated or something along those lines. So his spirit was troubled. okay, agitated, and his sleep left him. And literally, by the way, the expression in the original language is that his sleep was against him. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced this in the past, but if you've ever been in a really difficult circumstance and you're having trouble sleeping, you're tired and you're exhausted and you go to bed, but you have this dream about the anxieties of what you're facing tomorrow or the distress that you've been under leading up to this moment, and you just can't sleep. And when you go to sleep, you try to sleep, but your thoughts are dominated, and when you wake up, you're more tired than when you went to sleep. That idea. Okay, that's the expression here. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, plural, which gives you the indication that it is a recurrent dream. This is something that is happening multiple times, multiple days in a row. We're not actually told the length of time, but for a period of time, he has this recurrent dream. How do you know it's a recurrent dream? Because he's going to give orders to call all the wise men in and say, I had a dream. There's one dream, and he keeps having that same dream over and over and over again, and it is disturbing him. Now, we're going to find out next week what that dream was. He's dreamed of this great statue and of this huge rock that comes down and crushes it. And he has no idea what it means. But it's really bothering him. And he knows that this isn't just a normal dream because it's recurrent. And every time he has it, he's wondering about it. He's anxious about it. And every time he goes to sleep, he has it, and he's more agitated, and his sleep is working against him. And you can imagine going without sleep and having any sleep that you do have for a period of time winds up getting you a little frazzled. Do you agree? Anybody ever experienced some sleepless nights due to the stress of life? And now you're a little frazzled, and you're a little bit on end, and you're a little short-tempered? This might help you to understand. Hopefully, none of you have gone this far, but hopefully you'll be able to understand when Nebuchadnezzar says, that's it, I want you to kill them all. The reason that he pops off like that is because he's been without sleep quite possibly for several weeks. So, he's had dreams. His spirit is troubled. His sleep left him. He can't sleep, and when he does, he wakes up more anxious than when he went to bed. Verse 2, and the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. So they came and were presented before the king. He's calling for all of his wise men. Now, I did a little bit of extra homework this week on the categories of wise men that are listed here. And it's a pretty interesting study, and there's a lot written on it, and there's not a lot of agreement on the distinct occupations and professions, the distinctives between these various specifics regarding wise men. But I do think that I can share with you a general idea what we're talking about each of these categories, and maybe it will help you to understand a little better as to what was involved in being a wise man in those days. The categories that are listed here in Daniel 2 are magicians, conjurers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. Now, when we think of a magician, we'll just start with that one. When we think of a magician, we're thinking about somebody who does sleight of hand, right? Misdirection, card tricks, or I know your card, and they're really just masters of shuffling, stuff like that, or the masters of having, a playing card mysteriously appear in Leah's purse, stuff like that, right? You think of magicians like that. We know they're not really doing magic, or are we? Right? But there's obviously a trick associated with it. That's what we think about with magicians. The term magician doesn't mean magician like what we're thinking about it, nor does it necessarily refer to magicians the way you think about it in fantasy novels, like Gandalf or any of the other fantasy stories. I spent a lot of time looking at each of these terms individually, and the amount of work done by scholars on the specifics of each of these words and the offices or functions that made each unique in the service of the king is still largely a debated mystery. But what I can tell you is this: magicians is a term that was applied primarily to those who were tied in their practices to some kind of priestly service. So a magician is normally associated with some pagan god. Like the magicians in Egypt that stood before Pharaoh and opposed Moses. They were Egyptian priests, and they were tied to the Egyptian gods. And they did signs and wonders in the names of those Egyptian gods that they served. A lot of times that's associated with mystery religions and occult power and things of that nature. When you're talking about conjurers, this is a term that can be related to astrologers, interpreters of the signs in the sky, enchanters, exorcists, or even those involved in necromancy. And by that, I mean those who say that they can do a seance or they can smoke a pipe or whatever and get in contact with your ancestors or their ancestors or something along those lines, speaking to the dead, casting out evil spirits from people, consulting the dead for information. That's conjurers. Sorcerers is a term that basically refers to practicing witchcraft, casting spells or enchantments, either through the use of charms, mixing potions, even getting into the necromantic arts where you could facilitate speaking to the dead. And there's a lot of overlap between these technical terms. I want you to keep your finger here in Daniel 2 and turn back to Exodus with me for just a moment. I want you to see the same kinds of terms and see a couple of events that happened in the days of the Exodus where the wise men of Egypt revealed I want you to see how the terms are used and the kinds of things they were said to be able to do. In Exodus chapter 7, if you just slide down to verse 8, Moses and Aaron are sent by God to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And they get there, and the Lord spoke to Moses and saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle, okay, do a sign that proves that your God is powerful and I need to pay attention to you, then you tell Aaron, Moses, to take his staff, throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and they did just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Lo and behold, God enables Moses to have Aaron throw his staff down, and it turns into a snake, a great snake. And that happens. And then Pharaoh also called for the wise men. Notice the categories again. The wise men, the sorcerers, and also the magicians of Egypt. Same kinds of titles referring to those kinds of guys involved in the occult and those kinds of things. So Pharaoh calls for his wise men, the magicians of Egypt, and they did the same thing with their secret arts. They actually throw staves down. And notice it says in verse 12, each one threw down his staff, they turned into serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staves, and yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he didn't listen to them. Slip down a little further. Notice when God has Moses turn the Nile into blood. In verse 20, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the staff, struck the water that was in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul so that the Egyptians couldn't drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, not with the Nile, but turning water into blood, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, just like the Lord said. Now, if you skip over into chapter 8, you'll notice that the Lord says in verse 5 to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the streams, and over the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron did that, and lo and behold, frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. The land is overrun with frogs. Verse 7, the magicians did the same thing with their secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Now, whether they just went to a pond or whether they did it from and just called it whatever, they were able to demonstrate that same kind of a sign. This is the magicians of Egypt, tied to the gods of Egypt. Well, then you get to the plague of insects. Verse 16, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff, strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats or insects throughout all the land of Egypt. They did so. Aaron struck out his hand with his staff, struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats throughout all the land of Egypt. So many of you really like bugs. Can you imagine if the whole of the valley was full of bugs? That's what God did to Egypt as a sign. I want you to notice what happens here. Verse 18, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. They couldn't do the same sign, and they could not prevent the sign from happening. And notice their response. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is what? This is a finger of God. This is the power of a God beyond us. This is a sign way above our pay grade. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. This is all part of God's process of demonstrating. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think those magicians, those wise men of Egypt, and by the way, notice they were called magicians, just called the magicians of Egypt after that first introduction of all the different types of wise men? Magicians becomes a general category. In Daniel chapter 2, that's what we have with the term Chaldeans. It becomes the general category. Okay? Did those magicians of Egypt, did the wise men of Egypt actually do those signs? Yes. Yes. Why? Why would they be able to do that? Because the forces of darkness are involved, and God allows that. In that ancient context, God allowed that to happen. Yes. Yes, there are demons. Yes, there are forces of darkness. Do you know Paul in the New Testament says when people start to worship a statue, a demon inhabits that statue and pretends to be that God and behave in a way that convinces people to worship that false god? That's not new. That's not new. That's not unheard of. So when you talk about going back to Daniel 2 now, why would God let stuff like that happen? And yet there would be limits of it because God is sovereign and because He allows false miracles to happen to test people and to give people over to the evil that they want to dedicate themselves to. Incidentally, you can read this afternoon. I'm not going to walk through it this morning. But write this down in your notes. 1 Samuel 28. 1 Samuel 28. When Saul is near the end of his life and everything is going against him, he knows it. And he's got forces surrounding him, and he says, I got to find somebody that can speak to the dead to let me talk to Samuel. So he asks if there's any spiritual advisor in a neighborhood he can talk to, and his men go, well, there is the witch at Endor. And he says, all right, let's go. And he goes and he walks in, and she's surprised to see him and thinking that he's trying to trap her so he can execute her. He goes, no. I want you to bring up Samuel. I want to talk to him. Well, Samuel's dead. Well, aren't you a witch? Yes. So she goes through her necromantic little ritual, and lo and behold, Samuel shows up. And Samuel confronts and condemns Saul for his behavior. But what's most noteworthy in the account, as we're looking at it right now, is this. when Samuel shows up, the witch is terrified. You know why? It's not because it's all a show. It's because normally the demon that shows up to speak to her is not the one who shows up. She recognizes it as Samuel and is terrified. We go back to Daniel chapter 2. And the last word here is Chaldeans. Chaldean is an ethnic or a racial term, as well as a term associated with the wise men. That goes through the whole book of Daniel. Okay? It's a term that a lot of times is used to refer to a racial heritage, those actually from Babylon, the native Babylonians, the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean. But the term here is being used specifically to refer to those ancient Chaldeans who had also chosen to be in the scholarly path of being a wise man of Babylon. This is probably the foundation of the Magi in Matthew 1 and 2. These wise men, were characterized by being those who were scholars, students of the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, astrology and astronomy. They were documenters of dreams. In fact, archaeologists, I found it interesting reading in the last couple of weeks, archaeologists have actually found libraries of dream journals where when Gray has mushrooms on his pizza on Tuesday evening and he dreams a dream and the next day doesn't go so well for him at work, then he shares that dream with one of the wise men and they document the details of the dream and they document the way his next day went. And then Gina cooks this really big meal and Chuck eats 2 helpings of chocolate chip cookies beforehand and then washes it down with a big old root beer, and the next morning he's not feeling so well. Okay, so, and during the night, this is the dream that he had. We write that dream down. And so they actually it's like a law library, basically. I don't know if you know what a law library is. Well, a law library is filled with volumes of case studies. It's got a record of every case and all the details of the court argumentation, and then the rendering of the verdict and the justification of that verdict. And it becomes case law, sets precedent for the way you interpret future cases. In the same way, the dream volumes worked. So when these Chaldeans, when you come in and you tell a Chaldean, hey, listen, I had a dream. Tell me the dream, and I'll go do my homework and look and see if there have ever been any other dreams that have been like that, and I'll tell you whether it's good or bad. I'll tell you what it typically means. Because every time somebody dreams about a lion, or every time somebody dreams about a chicken, or every time somebody dreams about this, it goes this way. So it actually was a scientific, scholarly exercise of futility. And when we look at all these terms, we can see that some are leveraging the occult, others are efforts to study the past, some are trying to read signs, and some are somewhat scholarly in their efforts. They're all seeking to interpret past and present situations in order to give counsel for the future. This is very common through ancient Near Eastern religions and societies, especially in the despot age and beyond. These were the wise men of Babylon. Much like the wise men, counselors, witch doctors, shaman, priests, and oracles that most ancient rulers relied upon to seek favor or counsel from their gods, interpret the signs and portents of the seasons, reading tea leaves and predicting the future by looking to the stars or studying the signs of the zodiac. And Nebuchadnezzar is so disturbed by this dream, he calls all these guys in. They're all on the payroll. These are all the experts of interpreting what's going on. So he calls them all in. And in verse 3, the king says to them, I had a dream. Notice he doesn't say, I'm having dreams. It's a recurring dream. I had a dream. And my spirit is anxious, and that's that same word for troubled, distress. My spirit is anxious to understand the dream. So the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And this is the point in the book of Daniel when the narrative switches to Aramaic from this point all the way until the end of chapter 7. Why? Because from this point until the end of chapter 7, Daniel is focused on a message to the Gentiles. When you get to chapter 8, we return to a message, revelation for Israel again. I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. So the Chaldeans, notice there's just one term used because it's referring now to all of the wise men as a group. O king, live forever. That's like long live the king. That's just a formal way that kings are addressed in that ancient Near Eastern context. A polite, a submissive, honorable response. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. Why? Because that's their job. That's their nature. That's why they're on the payroll. Notice their readiness and willingness to be of service. It's right up their alley. And the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb. Literally means you will become members. I will dismember you. Well, now that's really polite. You will be torn limb from limb. And by the way, those kinds of things were literally consequences of disobeying a king or offending a king. The context of the ancient Near East and under despotic rule, this kind of violence, this kind of swift and brutal expression of judgment, these kinds of things are real. He says, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made literally a dung heap. Waste management, new locations will be popping up where your residence is. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation. So what has the king just said? I don't just want you to tell me the interpretation. I want you to tell me the dream and then give me the interpretation. Why? Well, you're going to see here momentarily, because he wants them to tell him what his dream is so he knows he can trust when they give him the interpretation. That's really the interpretation. Now, there's an interpretive issue I need to walk you through here, and it's really the toughest one in the first half of the book. The dating of the king's reign and those kinds of things are not that hard if you do your homework, but this one took some time. If you have a King James Bible, you will notice that in verse 5, the king replies to the Chaldeans, and he doesn't say, the command from me is firm. What he says is, the thing from me is gone. So if you have a King James translation, the implication is, I forgot the dream. The thing, the matter, the dream, it's gone. And I got to tell you, the more I worked through this and the more I was studying this, there's a significant, since we switched into Aramaic and we have loan words from two other languages, I'll just say that I would not assign this as a project to MDiv students. And I started chasing this down and working through it, and you can make a good case for this being the thing from me is gone as opposed to the command from me is firm. So you can make a case for the king having forgotten the dream here. But when I did all my homework, I was, he hasn't forgotten the dream. This is, the best way to translate it is just the way we have it in the New American Standard. However, there's no one I have a higher regard for in the whole of my life than John MacArthur. And I remember years ago when we packed up my mother-in-law into a truck and drove across country. I remember listening to my favorite Daniel series of all time, and I listened to MacArthur, all of them in a row. It was a glorious trip across the country, especially with the governor on the truck, so I can literally listen to like 10 tapes in a row. I had a little tape deck on the seat next to me. It's awesome. I said, you know what? In preparation for preaching through Daniel again, I want to listen to MacArthur again. So I started listening through MacArthur. And you know what MacArthur concluded here in 1979? Daniel forgot the dream. And I thought, am I missing something? And I went back and I worked through it. And I said, no, I'm not missing something. In fact, I got a few good reasons why, as we walk through the rest of this, why I'm really sure that he didn't forget the dream. He remembers it, and this is the right way to translate it. And yesterday afternoon, it dawned on me, oh, I didn't check the Legacy Bible. So I went ahead and opened up the Legacy Bible. And do you know what it says? It says firm. And you know what MacArthur's study note says? It says firm. He didn't forget the dream. And I went, wow. MacArthur changed his view before he graduated and went to heaven. Important safety tip here. Just because a spiritual hero holds a different position doesn't mean they're right about everything. And MacArthur, I still remember when the study Bible first came out, there was a guy that asked on a Sunday night Q&A. There was a guy that came out and said, Pastor John, I'm reading my study Bible, and a note you say this, but I remember in tape GC, whatever the number was, that this is what you said. And MacArthur, everybody laughed, and then MacArthur laughed, and he said, well, you know what? That was 10 years ago, and I hope it's okay with you if I continue to learn just like you're continuing to learn. So when you listen to MacArthur's tapes, and you definitely should, this is the best series on Daniel I've ever come across. But when you get there and he says that the king forgot the dream, ultimately the impact and the interpretation of the end is minimal. But while we're walking through here, I want you to see that the king says definitively to the Chaldeans, the command for me is firm. The instruction I've given you to give me the dream and then its interpretation, that's steadfast, that's firm, that's immovable. If you don't make known to me the dream and its interpretation, I'm going to have you dismembered, and I'm going to have your house leveled and turned into a trash heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. And you can see that's exactly what he does for Daniel by the time we get to the end of the chapter. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation. Verse 7, they answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. By the way, the simple fact that they are asking again for him to tell them the dream means he didn't just tell them, I forgot it. Right? Otherwise, they would just right at this point say, well, if you don't know the dream, how are we supposed to tell it to you? And how would you even know if we told you this was your dream if you don't remember it? They don't have any objection like that. They literally just say, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we'll declare the interpretation. The fact they persist in asking him to tell them the dream makes it clear he didn't tell them he forgot it. Notice in verse 8, though, the king replies, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. Same word from above. Not the command from me is gone. The command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation has changed. You're just playing for time until I finally just let it go. Therefore, tell me the dream. And notice, he says why he wants them to tell him the dream. Tell me the dream so that I may know you can declare to me its interpretation. This is bothering him so much. He's treating them differently than he ever has. He has a different requirement than ever because this dream so has him. And by the way, who gave him the dream? God. God is orchestrating this whole deal and pushing the king in such a way that he's making, humanly speaking, historically speaking, an absolutely unreasonable request of his wise men. And that's what they say. Look at verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king." Nobody could do that. Inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult. You could even translate this essentially impossible. And there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods. And keep in mind, they believe in a plurality of gods, whose dwelling place is not with flesh. Okay? No human being could answer this. And no king has ever asked for this because it's impossible. You're being unreasonable. You're being irresponsible. You're insane if you think that anybody could ever do that. Now notice, the king takes it well. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious. Do you know what indignant means? It means very furious. You know what very furious means? It means indignant. This is a super emphatic way to say he lost it. This is throwing the wrench and breaking the windshield type of losing it. Okay? This is flipping the table and the pieces of the game scatter across the house. Okay? This is a Monopoly move. This is and in this case, the guy is so wound up, and he's an absolute ruler. When he loses it and makes it decree, that's just the end. The king became indignant and very furious, and he gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. That's it. That's it. Dismember them all. Destroy their houses. We're done with all of them. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. They looked for Daniel and his friends. Why? If they've already graduated, why aren't they there? Because the only ones that were called into the king's presence are the high-ranking muckety-mucks. Daniel and his friends are at entry-level positions, and they've only been there for, at most, a month or two. But they're on the payroll now. Guess what that means? They're included in wise men, and by the way, if they're still students, they're not actually wise men yet. So they wouldn't be included in this. So we have the dream concealed. The God gives the king a dream, and the king conceals it from the wise men because it so bothers him, this dream that God has given him, that he's not going to tell anybody. He expects somebody to tell him so that he knows for sure he can trust what they're saying the interpretation is. Now I want you to notice that God reveals the dream to Daniel, verses 14 to 23. And we can go through this pretty quick. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch. Discretion and discernment is a little awkward in English. Basically, the expression in Aramaic conveys that idea of speaking counsel or conversing in a wise and skillful manner and addressing somebody. It's the idea of a direct yet tactful approach. And you can see that in the question that Daniel asked. Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" You could even translate that word urgent as severe. Like so immediate and severe is kind of the idea. And Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. You know, I got to imagine that if all of a sudden I've been a wise man, on the payroll for a month or two, I'm still learning my job, and I'm not even in the meeting, and now all of a sudden I'm being executed as a wise man, my normal reaction would be, whoa, I'm not really part of the group. I'm new here, okay? Right? Daniel doesn't reply that way. Notice, Daniel replies in a humble and a discerning and a tactful way. He just asks Arioch, the king's commander who's been charged with rounding up all the wise men so they can all be dismembered. He says, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" I want you to notice Daniel makes a humble request of the king's commander, and the king responds to it. You know the way I suspect would normally happen if a young guy... Daniel is only like 17 at this point. You understand that? He's 17, and he hears he's going to be executed because his new job that he has, the king has decided that you're all going to die. And Daniel's response is just as a humble servant, well, why is the king so upset? And why is the charge so severe? And Arioch, even though he's a senior captain of the guard, actually answers him. And he not only answers him, I want you to notice that he then goes ahead and takes him into the king. Verse 16, so Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. How does Daniel gain access to the king at this point? He's just a young man. He's only been on the payroll for a couple of months. Well, in his humble and tactful response to the death sentence to Arioch, he secures Arioch being willing to go, well, let me tell you why, instead of just, come on, boy. And when he tells him why, Daniel obviously says, well, let me go talk to the king. And Arioch, even though he's likely putting his own head at risk, takes Daniel in. And then Daniel goes before the king. Now, on what basis would a 17-year-old guy that's still a student have any ability to be granted access to the king? You know the only thing that makes sense? The king remembers him from a couple of months ago when he passed his exam. And so Daniel says to Arioch, why is the king so off the charts here? Well, let me just tell you. Well, take me into the king and let me talk to him. Okay. And he takes him into the king. And you know what Daniel asked for? Look at verse 16. What does Daniel request of the king? That he would give him time. Do you know what the king just decreed to all the rest of his wise men? You know what they can't have? Time. Daniel walks in and asks for time. But notice, when Daniel asks for time, it's not to play games. He literally says, King, please give me some time in order that I can declare the interpretation to you. Give me some time to go do my homework and come back and give you. You know what I would bet you? If the wise men had responded this way, the king would have granted them the time. But they said it's impossible. We can't do it. Now, why would Daniel think it's possible? Because he's trusting not in himself or his own abilities. He's trusting in what? He's trusting in God. He's trusting in God. The reason that the other guys didn't ask for time is because they knew there was no way they would ever be able to do it. You can see in a 17-year-old faith that most senior saints do not have anything near it. And this is Daniel. He goes in and asks of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation. Please give me time so that I can do what you ask. And the king grants it to him. And notice that immediately what Daniel does after that is he goes home and he makes his request of God. Daniel went to his house, informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter. All right, well, here's what's really going on. And he tells them so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven. Notice the title, the God of heaven. They're in captivity in Babylon. They're not addressing him as Yahweh at this point. They are addressing him as the sovereign God over all nations. Daniel goes to his house and tells his friends so that they might together request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed together with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Verse 19, and then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. This is really amazing. Not so much the idea of just getting it in a night vision. This is God giving direct revelation to Daniel in a vision at night, giving him the vision of that, exactly of that dream that he's had Nebuchadnezzar dreaming repeatedly now, and the interpretation of it. That's not, I mean, there's a sense in which that's amazing, all right? But what's really amazing to me is Daniel's immediate response. Notice at the end of verse 19, then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And he said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power, and even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Now, I got a question for you. How does he know for sure that it actually is the king's dream? He's not actually going to know until he walks into the king's presence and says, this is the dream, right? And the king doesn't kill him. By the way, even if he tells the king what his dream is, if the king doesn't like the interpretation, what could happen to him? You're dying anyways because I don't like your answer. Daniel doesn't wait for any of that. When Daniel is given the revelation, he is convinced that God has revealed it all to him, and he just gives thanks and praise to him, trusting that it is true and reliable. His commitment to God, his trust in his word, his trust in his revelation is absolute. We could spend a lot of time looking here at verses 19 to 23 at the way that Daniel praises God. But since we just went through Psalm 139 last week, let me just summarize it quickly this way. Notice that when God answers Daniel and his buddy's prayer about giving them the revelation of the mystery of what was Nebuchadnezzar's dream and what does it mean, Daniel's response is to bless the God of heaven. That word bless is a word that when it's used as a verb that God blesses, God is the one doing the blessing, it means that God is empowering someone to do something. When it is used from a human being to describe blessed be God, it attributes God with the one having empowered to do something. That's why a lot of times it's translated like praise or thank. Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel praised God for his granting this enablement to know the dream. And he did so in these words, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. The name of God speaks of the reputation of God. Let God's reputation be blessed, be praised because of what he provides forever and ever. Why? Because wisdom and power belong to him. Because he knows everything and he is all powerful. Sound a little bit like Psalm 139? And then he goes through both of those, power and wisdom, in the next two verses and praising him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. By the way, Daniel is 17 and he's seen this multiple times, hasn't he? He saw Josiah die. He's seen Jehoiakim on the throne and forced to submit to both the king in Egypt and now the king of Babylon. He's seen Nebuchadnezzar reign. He's seen Pharaoh take authority over Jerusalem, etc. He's seen the change in kings. And has been caught up and moved around as a result of it. And he acknowledges that the one who is all-powerful and in control of times and seasons and who's in power and who's not, it is God who changes the times and the epochs, God who removes kings and establishes kings, God who gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. And he praises his omniscience. It's he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. What did we see in Psalm 139 last week? Darkness and light are the same to him. He sees everything. He knows everything. He's almighty, all-powerful everywhere. And when he closes off in verse 23, he specifically praises and thanks God for giving him the dream and its interpretation. To you, O God of my fathers. O God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the rest, I give thanks and praise. Why? Because you have given me wisdom and power. Even now, even at this moment, on this occasion, you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. I know the answer to the dream, and I know what it means because you've given it to me. May I just say that this is the proper response to answered prayer? I suspect many of us pray and ask for a lot of things. God, help me in this conversation with my boss. God, help me in this conversation with my spouse. God, help me have this conversation with one of my kids or whoever. God, help me through this. And then you get through it. When you get through it, when He's provided for you, how many times you actually take a moment at that juncture and go back and say thanks? Or you just check it off and move on. Hey, I got through that. I want you to notice that Daniel hasn't even gotten through all of it, and he's already praising and giving thanks to God. The only person that in my mind, scripturally, that comes close to Christ that I just am afraid to compare myself to is Daniel. And he's 17, and he's standing tall like the Apostle Paul. It's amazing. He doesn't know how this is all going to turn out. He has no way to confirm that what God revealed to him it actually is the dream and its interpretation, but he trusts God, he asks, he got it, and he trusts and he praises. Now, the one question that I want to ask, that I want you to have in your mind over the course of this next week before we come back next week and finish this, why would God do this? Why would God give this dream to Nebuchadnezzar and have him just bothered by it and hot and bothered by it and so put out about it that he would ask his wise men to tell him the dream, which is something they just plain couldn't do, and it forces them to admit, hey, that's impossible. Why do you think God would do all that? To make it possible for Daniel to have the opportunity to demonstrate as God's man that God does have the answer. Even though his people are in captivity in Babylon, God is still on the throne. This is the means by which God has chosen not only to put his glory and his wisdom and his power and might on display for Nebuchadnezzar and for the whole Gentile world, this is also the way that God is facilitating to get his men, Daniel and his friends, into positions of authority of power there in Babylon. You want to know why God sent those 4 teenagers into captivity when they did nothing wrong but were doing everything right? Obviously, because of the way they behaved when they got to Babylon. You want to know why God did that? So that they could be exactly where they needed to be to glorify him and protect his people in captivity. Why do you have the kinds of trials that you have in your life? Why do you think? Why do you think tragedy strikes your house? Why do you think blessing comes to your house? Do you think it's circumstantial? Do you think it just happens? Listen, granted, there's a lot of times when things happen in our lives as a consequence of our actions. If you behave unwisely, there are typically repercussions. If you quit your job, pretty soon you're going to have trouble paying your bills, right? If you behave in an ungodly way at work, typically things won't go well for you. If you live a life that's upright and honest and characterized by integrity, you typically will have a happy life. But if you're a Christian, every circumstance in your life is also superintended by God for your good and his glory. Why do you have the spouse you have? Why do you have the kids you have? Why do you have the job you have? Why are you in the circumstance you have? Why do you have the health condition you have? Why do you have the neighbor you have? Why are you in the church you're in? Because this is exactly the perfect place for you to be to glorify God. Can I just encourage you for a moment to think about how Daniel keeps responding to things that are unfair that happen to him and how he continues to trust God through the whole thing and just seek to honor and glorify God while he goes through it? I'm not saying that God is going to give you special revelation. I'm not saying that God is going to allow you to be thrown into a fiery furnace or a lion's den. But I'll tell you this. The same God who is the God of Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah is my God. Is he yours? Are you one of his? Then like Daniel, you need to trust him. Father, thanks for this day and for your word and for the incredible way that you have demonstrated yourself even through the life of Daniel and his friends, your sovereignty. Thank you for the prophetic revelation that we'll be looking at next week that you have given that demonstrates that you not only know what is going to transpire throughout history, you're in control of it. You have a goal and a purpose and an intention for the outworking of the rest of redemptive history leading up even to the second coming of Christ and the establishment of your kingdom here on this earth. Lord, you are God and there is no other. Help us to live lives that worship you and demonstrate trust and faith in you until you return for us or call us home. In Christ's name, amen.